old television producer finally breaks his silence about a night that changed everything. Elvis Presley sat across from Johnny Carson and said something so raw that the network cut it before America could hear. This secret stayed buried, but it's now revealed by the last living witness. What truth was too dangerous to broadcast? The last living witness. Peter Cushnick sits in his living room long past midnight, the blue glow of the television washing over his weathered face. At 88 years old, his hands shake slightly when he reaches for his coffee, but his mind remains sharp as broken glass. For decades, he carried a secret that felt too heavy to share, too dangerous to speak aloud. Now, with most of his colleagues gone and his own time running thin, silence feels like betrayal. He spent 30 years behind the scenes at The Tonight Show, back when Johnny Carson ruled late-night television like a benevolent king. Peter knew every inch of those studios in Burbank. He understood the language of red lights and hand signals, the delicate dance of live television, where one wrong move could ruin everything. Control rooms buzzed with tension during every taping, producers watching monitors with hawk-like focus, ready to cut feeds or delay broadcasts if anything went wrong. And sometimes, things went very wrong. Peter never planned to become a keeper of secrets. He wanted to make good television, to help Johnny shine, to go home each night knowing he had done his job well. But television in the 1970s operated differently than today. Networks held absolute power over what audiences saw and heard. If something happened on stage that made executives nervous, it simply disappeared. No social media existed to catch every moment. No cell phones recorded backup footage. The network controlled reality itself. For 47 years, Peter kept quiet. He attended funerals for cameramen who had been there that night. He watched audio engineers take the secret to their graves. He saw producers retire and fade away, their memories dissolving like sugar in water. One by one, the witnesses vanished until only Peter remained, the last living soul who truly remembered what happened when Elvis Presley walked onto Johnny Carson's stage. People think they know everything about Elvis. They have watched his movies, memorized his songs, analyzed his every public appearance. Fans treasure bootleg recordings and behind-the-scenes photographs. Historians have written thick books documenting his life minute by minute. But they do not know this. Peter remembers the night with cruel clarity. Elvis arrived at the studio looking thinner than expected, his famous jumpsuit hanging slightly loose. Something haunted his eyes, a desperate quality that made the crew exchange worried glances. Johnny greeted him warmly, and the audience erupted in applause that seemed to last forever. Everything appeared normal, perfect even, exactly what millions of viewers wanted to see. Then Elvis started talking. At first, his words followed the usual script. He joked with Johnny, charmed the crowd, and flashed that legendary smile. But then something shifted. His voice changed, dropping lower, becoming urgent. He leaned forward in his chair and said something that made Johnny's smile freeze. The audience fell silent, confused, unsure if this was part of the show. In the control room, Peter watched his director's face go pale. Hands flew across the soundboard. The tape delay system, their safety net for live television, suddenly became their most important tool. Within seconds, decisions were made. The footage would be cut. Those words would never reach living rooms across America. Peter can still hear Elvis's exact phrase echoing through his memory. 15 words that explained everything and changed nothing. 15 words that suggested Elvis Presley knew something terrible, something he desperately needed the world to understand before it was too late. The room went silent, then commercial break. When they returned, Elvis looked deflated, defeated. Johnny skillfully steered the conversation towards safer waters. The show ended, the audience went home, and the truth stayed locked in a vault that no longer exists. Now, Peter sits alone in the darkness, the last guardian of a moment that history erased, wondering if speaking finally matters when everyone else has already forgotten how to listen. The night Elvis didn't play a role. The studio felt different that evening, though Peter could not explain why. May 1973 brought warm California air through the ventilation systems, mixing with cigarette smoke that hung like fog under the stage lights. The audience filed in with electric anticipation, dressed in their best clothes, hoping to witness television magic. Applause signs glowed red above their heads, ready to prompt reactions at precisely the right moments. Elvis was scheduled to appear during the second half of the show. Backstage, crew members whispered about how thin he looked, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought nobody was watching. His famous jumpsuit, white with gold embroidery, seemed tailored for a larger man. But his smile remained intact, that devastating grin that had conquered the world 2 decades earlier. When Johnny Carson introduced him, the audience exploded with sound. People leaped from their seats screaming, applauding so hard their hands must have hurt. Elvis walked onto that stage like a king returning to his throne, waving, nodding, soaking in the adoration he had known since he was 21 years old. Under the bright lights, he sparkled. From a distance, everything looked perfect. But Peter watched from the control room, through a bank of monitors, and screens tell truths that audiences miss. He saw how Elvis gripped the chair arm too tightly when he sat down. He noticed how Johnny's smile flickered for just a moment, a subtle shift that meant the host sensed something unusual. Johnny Carson had interviewed thousands of people. He could read discomfort like other men read newspapers. The interview began smoothly enough. Johnny asked about Elvis's recent tour, and Elvis responded with practiced charm. He told a funny story about a hotel room mix-up that made the audience laugh. He complimented Johnny's suit. He seemed like the Elvis everyone expected, the polite Southern gentleman who revolutionized music but never forgot his manners. Then something started to slip. Elvis's answers grew longer, his voice softer. He stopped making eye contact with Johnny and began staring at the audience as if searching for someone specific. His words came slower, each sentence requiring visible effort. Johnny tried to steer things back on track with a lighthearted question about Elvis's favorite foods, a safe topic that usually generated easy laughs. Instead, Elvis paused for several long seconds. The silence stretched uncomfortably. The audience shifted in their seats, unsure if this was part of the performance. Finally, Elvis began talking about something completely unrelated to food. He spoke about pressure, about expectations, about how fame felt like carrying an ocean on your shoulders while everyone watched to see if you would drown. The audience laughed nervously, assuming this was self-deprecating humor. Johnny smiled, but Peter could see the concern in the host's eyes. This was not scripted. This was not rehearsed. This was a man speaking from somewhere deep and wounded, pulling truth from places celebrities were supposed to keep locked away. Elvis kept going. He talked about loneliness in crowded rooms, about smiling until your face ached, about wondering if anyone saw the real person underneath the costume. His voice carried an urgency that made the studio feel smaller, more intimate, almost uncomfortably personal. This was not the Elvis who sang about hound dogs and blue suede shoes. This was someone else entirely, someone fragile and honest and afraid. In the control room, Peter felt his stomach tighten. Directors and producers exchanged glances. Should they cut to commercial? Should they let this continue? The tape delay gave them options, but nobody moved. They were frozen, watching something unprecedented unfold. Johnny tried again to redirect the conversation, asking about Elvis's upcoming movie. Elvis nodded slowly, as if returning from somewhere far away. Then he leaned forward in his chair, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. He looked directly into the camera, past Johnny, past the audience, speaking to everyone and no one. What he said next was not an answer to any question. It was not a joke or a story or casual conversation. It was a statement, clear and deliberate, carrying weight that pressed down on everyone in that room. The audience stopped laughing. This was no longer an interview. This had become a confession. When the studio fell silent, the temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Peter felt it through the glass of the control room, that invisible shift when collective breath gets held and time moves differently. Elvis sat forward in his chair, his decorated jumpsuit catching the lights, but his face had transformed into something raw and unguarded. Johnny Carson's legendary composure finally cracked. His smile disappeared completely. He glanced toward the control room, a quick flicker of his eyes that screamed for help, for guidance, for someone to tell him how to handle what was happening. But nobody had answers. This territory was unmapped. Elvis began speaking about things stars never discussed on television in 1973. He talked about handlers who controlled his every movement, about contracts that felt like chains, about doctors who gave him pills to wake up and different pills to fall asleep. His voice remained steady, but carried an edge of desperation, like a man who had been underwater too long and finally broke the surface. The audience sat completely still. A woman in the third row covered her mouth with her hand. A man near the aisle leaned forward, straining to hear every word. The applause sign stayed dark, forgotten, irrelevant. This was not a moment for manufactured enthusiasm. This was something else entirely, something that felt dangerous and sacred at the same time. Johnny tried once more to save the situation. He asked about Elvis's daughter, hoping the family would provide safer ground. Elvis smiled sadly and said he worried about what kind of world he was leaving for her, what kind of father he had been, while busy being Elvis Presley for everyone else. The honesty felt like broken glass, beautiful and sharp and capable of drawing blood. In the control room, Peter watched his director's hand hover over the console. Every technical person in that room understood what was at stake. The tape delay system gave them roughly 7 seconds to make decisions. 7 seconds to decide what America would see and what would vanish forever. Sweat appeared on foreheads. Cigarettes burned forgotten in ashtrays. Elvis kept talking. He mentioned feeling watched constantly, feeling trapped inside a persona he had created when he was barely more than a boy. He spoke about pressure from people he could not name, expectations he could not meet, a life that felt scripted by others while he simply performed his lines. His words painted a picture of golden handcuffs, of success that felt like suffocation. The cameramen did not move. Sound engineers stopped adjusting their equipment. Even the audience members who had come hoping to see a legend sing a song now sat witnessing something far more valuable and terrible. They were watching a human being admit that fame had become a prison, that success had teeth, that being Elvis Presley was eliminating the man who had invented him. Then Elvis said something specific, not vague complaints about fame or fortune. Something concrete about people in his life, about control, about situations that made him afraid. His voice dropped lower, but remained clear. Every syllable carried weight. He was not rambling. He was not confused. He was speaking the truth that had been locked inside him for years, and now the lock had broken. The control room erupted into whispered chaos. The director made frantic hand signals. The producer grabbed a phone. Legal concerns flooded the space like water through a cracked dam. This could not air. This absolutely could not reach American living rooms. The implications were enormous, the potential fallout catastrophic. Johnny Carson looked physically ill. His face had gone pale under his makeup. He tried to interject, to thank Elvis for his honesty, to move toward commercial break. But Elvis was not finished. He had more to say, more truth to unload, more confession to deliver. Peter watched all of this through the glass, his heart pounding, knowing that history was being made and simultaneously destroyed. His finger rested on the button that would cut the feed, that would erase these moments from existence. The decision had already been made. One person pressed one button, and Elvis's truth disappeared before it could become real. The cut that changed the story. The control room exploded into controlled panic. Peter watched his director's hand slam down on the console, fingers moving across buttons with practiced urgency. Red lights flashed. Audio levels dropped. The 7-second tape delay system, designed for exactly this kind of emergency, became their salvation and their weapon. On the monitors, Elvis continued speaking, his mouth moving, his eyes intense. But America would never hear those words. Technical magic was already rewriting reality. A backup segment, pre-recorded earlier that evening, was being cued. Viewers at home would see a smooth transition to commercial, unaware that history had just been erased in real time. The studio audience, however, heard everything. They sat in stunned silence, processing what Elvis had revealed, not yet understanding they had witnessed something that would officially never exist. Their memories would become the only evidence. And memories are easily dismissed, especially when contradicted by official records. Peter's phone rang immediately. Network executives calling from offices blocks away, their voices sharp with alarm. Legal concerns poured through the receiver like poison. What had Elvis said exactly? Could it expose the network to lawsuits? Were there defamation issues? Who else had been mentioned? The questions came faster than Peter could answer. On stage, Johnny Carson had finally regained control of his face. He thanked Elvis warmly, professionally. as if the last few minutes had been perfectly normal television. His voice carried just the right amount of enthusiasm, but his eyes told a different story. Peter had worked with Johnny for years and had never seen him look so shaken, so deeply uncomfortable with his own show. Elvis stood slowly, shaking Johnny's hand. What struck Peter most was the calmness that had settled over the singer. He was not angry or embarrassed. He looked almost relieved, like a man who had finally set down a burden he had carried too long. He smiled that famous smile one more time, waved to the audience, and walked off stage with his usual grace. Backstage became a hurricane of activity. Producers huddled in corners, whispering urgently. Network representatives arrived within minutes, suits and serious faces, demanding to see the raw footage. Security personnel appeared, though nobody could explain what they were securing against. The atmosphere felt less like a television studio and more like a crime scene being contained. Elvis was escorted to his dressing room by handlers who appeared seemingly from nowhere. Peter caught a glimpse of him through the partially open door, sitting alone, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked tired but peaceful, a man who had spoken the truth and now faced whatever consequences would follow. Johnny Carson did not record any more segments that night. He retreated to his private office and asked not to be disturbed. Peter heard later from Johnny's assistant that the host had sat in silence for over an hour, smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing. Whatever Elvis had said had affected Johnny deeply, shaking the foundation of what he thought he knew about fame and the people who carried it. The raw tape was collected immediately. Every copy was accounted for, logged, and locked away. Engineers who had recorded the audio were spoken to quietly, reminded of confidentiality agreements they had signed when joining the network. The message was clear without being stated directly. What happened tonight stays locked in this building. Peter returned to the control room after the chaos settled. The space felt haunted now, filled with the ghost of words that had been spoken but officially never heard. He replayed the moment in his mind, Elvis leaning forward, speaking with such clarity and purpose, revealing something the world was not supposed to know. The decision to cut the feed had been made in seconds, driven by fear and legal protection and the instinct to control narrative. But sitting alone in that quiet control room, Peter wondered if they had made the right choice. They had protected the network, protected the show's reputation, perhaps even protected Elvis from himself. But they had also buried the truth. The audience went home that night, carrying a secret. Elvis left the studio carrying his burden a little lighter, and Peter began carrying something new. The knowledge that sometimes television's greatest power is not what it shows, but what it chooses to hide. The words Elvis spoke did not disappear simply because America never heard them. They lived on in the minds of everyone present, growing heavier with each passing year, haunting them, waiting. The confession that followed. Elvis home. Elvis left the studio that night in May 1973 and seemed to take something irretrievable with him. Peter never spoke to him again, never saw him in person, but he watched. Everyone in America watched Elvis, though they did not know what Peter knew, did not carry the weight of those erased words. In the weeks following the taping, rumors began circulating through Hollywood's underground networks. Whispers passed between crew members, vague stories about Elvis saying something strange on Carson's show. Though nobody could agree on details, the rumors lacked specificity, shape, truth. They became like smoke, visible but impossible to grasp. The official broadcast showed nothing unusual, just Elvis being charming and slightly subdued, exactly what audiences expected from a tired superstar. But Peter noticed changes. He watched Elvis's subsequent television appearances with different eyes, listening for echoes of that night. On other talk shows, Elvis seemed more guarded, more careful with his words. His handlers stayed closer, hovering just off stage like nervous parents. His smile appeared more frequently, but meant less. Something had shifted. A door that briefly opened had been locked again, this time with heavier bolts. Johnny Carson never mentioned the incident. Not on air, not in private conversations that Peter witnessed, not even in the relaxed moments between tapings when hosts usually process difficult interviews. It was as if that entire evening had been surgically removed from Johnny's memory. But Peter saw how Johnny's expression changed whenever Elvis's name came up in production meetings. A shadow would cross his face, brief but unmistakable, before the professional mask returned. The guilt started slowly for Peter, creeping in during quiet moments when his mind wandered. Had they done the right thing by cutting that audio? They had protected the network, protected Johnny's show, perhaps protected Elvis from public scrutiny he could not handle. But what if silencing him had been the cruelest act of all? What if Elvis had needed the world to hear, needed the confession to become real, needed the truth to exist outside his own tortured mind? Peter began watching Elvis differently, seeing patterns that now made terrible sense. The weight fluctuations, the canceled concerts, the erratic behavior that gossip magazines love to dissect, all of it seemed connected to what Elvis had tried to reveal that night. The confession had explained everything people misunderstood about him. It provided context for the decline everyone witnessed, but nobody truly comprehended. Elvis was not simply a medication addict who lost control. He was not merely a once great performer who let fame destroy him. He was something more complicated, more human, more trapped than anyone realized. That night on Johnny's stage, he had tried to tell the world exactly what was happening to him, exactly who controlled his life, exactly why he felt like a prisoner in his own existence, and they had silenced him. 4 years later, in August 1977, Elvis passed away at Graceland. He was 42 years old. Peter heard the news while eating breakfast, and the coffee turned bitter in his mouth. The television showed the same footage everyone saw. Crying fans, shocked reporters, retrospectives celebrating a legendary career. Nobody mentioned what Elvis had tried to say on The Tonight Show. That moment remained buried, locked away, erased from history. Johnny Carson delivered a brief, respectful tribute on his show. His words were gracious and measured, honoring Elvis's contributions to music and culture. But Peter, watching from his living room, saw something beneath the professional delivery. He saw regret, or perhaps recognition, or maybe just the weight of knowing something the audience would never understand. Years passed. The 80s became the 90s. Elvis became a myth, larger in death than he had been in his final struggling years. Books were written, documentaries produced, conspiracy theories invented. People debated everything about Elvis except the one thing that mattered most, what he had tried to tell them before he ran out of time. Johnny Carson retired in 1992, ending an era of television that would never return. Peter attended the final taping, watching from the same control room where he had witnessed Elvis's confession 2 decades earlier. Johnny gave his famous wave goodbye, and Peter wondered if he was thinking about all the moments they had preserved and all the truths they had buried. Johnny passed away in 2005. The obituary celebrated his wit, his timing, his ability to make America laugh for 30 years. Nobody mentioned the night Elvis tried to speak, and Johnny had to watch it disappear. Now Peter sits alone in 2026, 88 years old, the last person alive who truly remembers. Everyone else who heard those words has passed away, taking their portion of the secrets to graves scattered across the country. Only one voice remains to tell what Elvis said. Only one witness left to decide if truth matters when everyone involved is gone. Why the truth stayed buried for decades. Peter has spent 47 years justifying the silence to himself, building elaborate explanations for why speaking seemed impossible. In the beginning, the reasons felt solid and legitimate. Television in 1973 operated under different rules than the chaotic media landscape of today. Networks wielded absolute power over content, and sponsors controlled networks through the simple threat of pulling funding. One controversial moment could destroy careers, cancel shows, bankrupt entire departments. The pressure came from everywhere simultaneously. NBC executives made it clear that what happened with Elvis was never to be discussed. Legal teams drafted memos about liability and defamation. Sponsors who had paid enormous sums for commercial slots during that episode wanted assurance their brands would not be associated with controversy. The machinery of corporate television ground forward, erasing inconvenient truths to protect profits and reputations. But Peter knows his silence was not purely about corporate pressure. Fear lived in his chest too, personal and consuming. Speaking out could have ended his career instantly. He had a mortgage, a family, a life built on his position at The Tonight Show. Whistleblowers in the television industry did not get rewarded with integrity awards. They got blacklisted, forgotten, erased, just like that audio tape. Loyalty also played its complicated role. Peter respected Johnny Carson deeply, admired his talent and professionalism. Johnny had not wanted to silence Elvis out of cruelty, but out of protective instinct, sensing that what Elvis was revealing could hurt him more than help him. Was it wrong to honor that judgment? Was loyalty to colleagues less important than abstract concepts of truth? The tape itself was archived according to standard procedures. It was labeled, dated, and filed in climate-controlled storage alongside thousands of other recordings. For several years, Peter knew exactly where it lived and could have retrieved it if courage had found him. But as time passed, the archive system changed. Studios were sold, storage facilities consolidated, old tapes transferred to new formats, or simply discarded to make room for more relevant content. By the mid-'80s, Peter tried to locate the original recording and discovered it had vanished into the chaos of corporate reorganization. Whether it was deliberately destroyed or simply lost to bureaucratic indifference, he never learned. The physical evidence disappeared, leaving only memories and aging minds as proof that anything unusual had occurred. Peter made a promise to himself somewhere in those middle decades. He would speak only when it no longer harmed anyone, only when all the players had exited the stage and consequences had faded into irrelevance. Elvis passed away in 1977. Johnny Carson passed in 2005. Network executives from that era had long since retired or passed away. The sponsors who once held such power had been absorbed into larger corporations that did not remember or care about a single television episode from 50 years ago. Now, at 88, Peter faces the arithmetic of mortality. His doctors speak in careful euphemisms about time remaining, about making peace with unfinished business. The secret that once protected careers and reputations has transformed into a weight that presses on his chest during sleepless nights. He realizes that silence, which once seemed like wisdom, has become its own form of betrayal. So, he speaks the truth that was cut. Elvis did not confess to scandal that night. He did not reveal affairs or medication sources or financial crimes. What he said was somehow more devastating because it was so human and so simple. He talked about losing himself inside the character of Elvis Presley, about feeling like a puppet controlled by Colonel Tom Parker, and other handlers who profited from his fame while caring nothing for his soul. He spoke about loneliness that no amount of screaming fans could penetrate. He described looking in mirrors and not recognizing the person staring back, only seeing the costume and the performance. He admitted that prescription medications were the only way he could sleep anymore, the only escape from the pressure of being an icon instead of a man. Most powerfully, Elvis said he was afraid of disappointing people who loved an image he could no longer maintain. Afraid of aging out of relevance, afraid that if he stopped being Elvis Presley for even a moment, everyone would abandon him, and he would discover there was nothing real left underneath. These were not the confessions of a spoiled celebrity complaining about wealth and fame. These were the words of a human being suffocating inside his own success, desperately trying to tell someone that the dream everyone envied had become a nightmare he could not wake from. The confession reframes everything people thought they understood about Elvis's decline. His weight gain was not simple laziness, but the physical manifestation of someone giving up the fight to maintain an impossible standard. His erratic behavior was not just medication abuse, but the actions of someone trapped in a life he no longer controlled. His death at 42 was not merely tragic, but almost inevitable. The final escape of a man who had been imprisoned by his own legend. Peter thinks about alternate histories, about what might have changed if America had heard Elvis that night. Would the public have responded with compassion or ridicule? Would it have freed Elvis to seek real help? Or would it have accelerated his isolation? These questions have no answers now, only endless speculation. But Peter knows one truth with absolute certainty. They cut the audio, not because Elvis was lying, but because he was telling the truth too clearly, too rawly, too honestly for television in 1973 to broadcast. Some truths make people uncomfortable. Some truths challenge the myths society needs to believe. And some truths are too real for entertainment.